Good evening, friends. Tonight, we'll drift slowly into a world blanketed in deep snow, where survival was measured not in days or weeks, but in the careful preparation of months. Where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it in your part of the world? I hope you found a comfortable place, somewhere warm and safe. Dim your lights if you haven't already. Rest your head on your pillow. Pull your blanket a little closer. Allow your breathing to soften, to deepen, to slow. Tonight's journey will carry you back centuries, to a time when winter was not merely a season to endure, but a formidable adversary that tested every ounce of human ingenuity and resilience. If this peaceful journey helps you unwind, feel free to like and subscribe, only if it feels right to you. But for now, let your eyes grow heavy, let your mind settle, and let me share with you the quiet, remarkable story of how people survived when the cold could kill in hours. Imagine, if you will, the late days of autumn. The air carries that particular crispness that promises change, that whispers of what is coming. The leaves have turned their brilliant reds and golds, and now they're beginning to fall, carpeting the forest floor in a rustling tapestry. The sun sits lower in the sky each day, and the nights grow longer, colder. For the indigenous peoples across the northern territories of what we now call North America, this was not a time for leisure. This was the gathering season, and every moment mattered. Let me tell you about the careful choreography of survival. In the northern plains, the Great Lakes regions, and the vast forests of the Northeast, communities understood something fundamental about winter. You could not wait for it to arrive before you prepared. By the time the first snows fell, your fate was already decided by the work you had or hadn't done in the months prior. There's something both sobering and strangely comforting about that certainty, isn't there? The knowledge that preparation, not luck, would see you through. Consider the Dakota and Lakota peoples of the northern plains. As early as August, they would begin moving their camps to areas rich with buffalo. The buffalo hunt was not merely about food, though that was certainly paramount. A single buffalo could provide meat, yes, but also hides for clothing and shelter, sinew for sewing and bowstrings, bones for tools, and fat for pemmican. Pemmican, that remarkable survival food, was made by drying strips of lean meat until they were completely desiccated, then pounding them into a powder and mixing them with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries. The result was something that could last for years without spoiling. If you've ever enjoyed a particularly dense energy bar during a hiking trip, you've tasted a distant descendant of pemmican, though I suspect the original was considerably less sweet and far more functional. The fat content was crucial. In a bitter cold, the human body burns through calories at an astonishing rate, and fat provides more than twice the energy of protein or carbohydrates. The women of these communities were the keepers of preservation knowledge, and what they knew could fill libraries. They understood that timing was everything. Meat dried in the humid days of July might spoil before winter truly sets in, but meat dried in the crisp air of September would keep through to spring. They knew which berries to gather: chokecherries, service berries, wild plums, and when each would be at its peak. These weren't casual foraging trips. They were organized expeditions where entire communities would work together, often covering miles of territory to reach the best gathering sites. let me share something that might surprise you. The Haudenosaunee, also known as the Iroquois Confederacy, were accomplished agriculturalists who grew what they called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash. By late October after the harvest, they would have stored away thousands of bushels of dried corn, beans braided into long strings and hung from lodge rafters, and squash that had been sliced into rings and dried. The corn was processed in multiple ways. Some was simply dried on the cob and stored. Some were ground into cornmeal. And some underwent a process called nixtamalization, cooking the corn with wood ash or lime, which not only made it easier to grind but actually increased its nutritional value by making the niacin more bioavailable. This process, developed independently by indigenous peoples, prevented pellagra, a potentially deadly disease caused by niacin deficiency. European settlers who adopted corn but not the nixtamalization process would suffer from pellagra for centuries. It's one of those quiet historical ironies that shows how sophisticated this knowledge truly was. Now, as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine the taste of maple sugar. The Anishinaabe and other Great Lakes peoples had perfected the art of tapping maple trees each spring, collecting the sap and boiling it down into syrup and sugar. This wasn't just a sweet treat, though it certainly was that. It was a valuable source of calories and a preservative. Maple sugar could be mixed with dried berries and stored in birch bark containers called makooks. These containers were ingeniously constructed, waterproof and durable, and they kept food dry through the dampest conditions. A small piece of maple sugar candy could provide a burst of energy during a long winter hunting expedition. The Anishinaabe would sometimes pack maple sugar with pemmican, creating something that was both nourishing and, dare I say it, almost pleasant to eat. The savory preparations were equally thoughtful. Wild rice, Menumin in Anishinaabemowin, was harvested from canoes in late summer in the lakes and rivers of the upper Great Lakes and northern plains. The process was labor-intensive but yielded a grain that was nutritious, filling, and kept beautifully when properly dried. After harvesting, the rice would be parched over low fires to dry it further and make the hulls easier to remove. Then came the dancing, yes, dancing, where people would put on special moccasins and gently tread on the rice to separate the grain from the chaff. The rice would then be winnowed in birch bark trays, with the wind carrying away the chaff while the heavier grains fell back into the basket. It's meditative work, rhythmic and communal, the kind of labor that builds not just winter stores but social bonds. And here's an unusual delicacy that might make you smile: dried fish eyes. Among the coastal and riverine peoples, nothing went to waste. Fish would be cleaned and split, then hung to dry on racks in the sun and wind. The heads, including the eyes, would be dried separately. The eyes, rich in fat and vitamins, were considered a special treat. Children would sometimes compete to see who could collect the most. It's the sort of detail that reminds us how different survival looked, how every calorie mattered, how waste was simply not an option. By November, if the work had been done well, a community would have hundreds of pounds of dried meat, fish, berries, and grain stored away. The storage itself was an art form. In the plains, food was kept in parfleches, rawhide containers painted with beautiful geometric designs. In the northeast, Underground cache pits lined with birch bark kept food cool and dry. In the Arctic regions, the Inuit would build stone cairns and use the natural refrigeration of the permafrost. There's a particular peace in knowing you're prepared, isn't there? That feeling when you've done the work, when you've put in the time and effort, and now you can rest a little easier. The communities settling in for winter had that knowledge. They had worked together through the bright days of summer and the golden days of autumn, and now, as the first snows began to dust the landscape, they could gather close and wait. As your breathing deepens and your body grows heavier against your bed, picture the last days before winter's true arrival. The final hunts, the final gatherings. The children playing in the slanting autumn light while their parents secured the last of the provisions. The smell of smoke and dried meat. The laughter and conversation as communities came together for the last outdoor gatherings before the cold would drive everyone inside. And now, let your mind drift gently into the next chapter, where winter arrives in earnest, and survival becomes a daily practice of wisdom and care. The snow falls softly now in your imagination. Large, gentle flakes that catch the last light of evening and transform the world into something hushed and magical. But beneath that beauty lies a very real danger. When temperatures plummet to 20, 30, 40 degrees below zero, and in some places even colder, human skin can freeze in minutes. Frostbite isn't a gradual process at those temperatures, it's swift and merciless. Death from exposure can occur in hours, sometimes less. So how did people survive? The answer begins with shelter, but not the kind of shelter you might imagine. Let me take you first to the northern plains, to the winter camps of the Sioux, Cheyenne, and Blackfoot peoples. Their winter homes were teepees, yes, but these were not the simple conical tents that popular imagination might conjure. A winter teepee was a masterpiece of engineering, refined over countless generations to create a microenvironment that could sustain life in conditions that would kill an unprepared person overnight. The structure began with poles, carefully selected for straightness and strength, arranged in a precise configuration. The covering was made from buffalo hides, not just any hides, but hides that had been carefully tanned, scraped, and treated until they were both durable and, surprisingly, somewhat breathable. A typical winter teepee might use 15 to 20 buffalo hides sewn together with sinew. The bottom edge of the teepee would be staked down and sometimes weighted with stones or packed with snow to seal out drafts. But here's where it gets truly ingenious. Many winter teepees had a double wall construction. An inner lining, called a dew cloth, hung from the poles about 5 or 6 feet up from the ground. This created an insulating air space between the inner and outer walls. Warm air from the central fire would rise, circulate in that space, and help regulate the interior temperature while also reducing condensation. The smoke from the fire would exit through the smoke flaps at the top, which could be adjusted with long poles to account for wind direction. On the coldest nights, additional insulation came from banking snow around the base of the teepee, creating essentially an igloo effect at ground level. Inside, the floor might be covered with dried grass, then layers of buffalo robes and furs. People slept in the warmest part of the teepee, which was typically at the back, opposite the entrance. The fire in the center was kept small but constant, fed throughout the night in shifts. And here's something that might surprise you. The interior of a well-constructed winter teepee, even in 30 below weather, could be kept at a comfortable 50 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit with remarkably little fuel. The key was the design, which maximized heat retention while allowing for necessary ventilation. Now let your mind travel east, to the forests of the Northeast, where the Anishinaabe and other woodland peoples built structures called wigwams. These were typically dome-shaped, constructed from a framework of bent saplings covered with sheets of birch bark or woven cattail mats. The materials varied by region. In areas without abundant birch, other barks or hides might be used, but the principle remained the same. Create an insulated, weatherproof envelope that was also relatively easy to construct and maintain. Winter wigwams were often partially buried. The floor level might be excavated a foot or two into the earth, which provided thermal mass and insulation. The earthen walls were lined with bark or mats, and the floor was covered with spruce boughs or cedar, which not only provided cushioning but also released aromatic oils that helped keep the air fresh. Multiple families might share a larger wigwam, their combined body heat contributing to the warmth. The entrance was typically a low doorway covered with a hide flap, and some wigwams had a small antechamber or vestibule that acted as an airlock, preventing cold air from rushing directly into the main living space when someone entered or exited. The fire was, again, central, literally and figuratively. It provided heat, light, and a place to cook. But managing a fire in an enclosed space is more complex than you might think. Too large a fire could make the space unbearably hot and smoky. Too small, and the cold would creep in. The ideal was a steady, moderate fire that could burn all night on a single loading of wood. Different woods were preferred for different purposes. Hardwoods like oak or maple burned longer and hotter. Softwoods like pine or cedar lit more easily and provided quick heat. The smoke, interestingly, helped preserve the bark and wood of the structure, acting as a natural preservative. For the Inuit of the Arctic, the challenges were even more extreme. Where other peoples faced winter as a difficult season, the Inuit faced it as the dominant condition of their environment. Their winter homes were often constructed partially or entirely from snow, the famous igloo, or more properly, igloo. An igloo is an extraordinary structure. Snow, when properly compacted, is an excellent insulator because it traps air pockets. The blocks for an igloo were cut from wind-packed snow using specialized saws traditionally made from bone or antler. The blocks were laid in a spiral, each one slightly smaller than the one below, creating a self-supporting dome. The final block, the keystone, was carefully fitted from inside, and then the builder would cut an exit. The entrance tunnel was typically built below the level of the main floor, which meant cold air, being heavier, would sink into the tunnel while warm air would stay in the dome. Some iglooit, the plural of igloo, had multiple chambers connected by tunnels, creating spaces for storage, sleeping, and cooking. Inside an igloo, the temperature could be maintained at a comfortable level, sometimes above freezing, even when the outside temperature was 50 below zero. The heat source was often a cullic, a soapstone lamp that burned seal or whale oil. A skilled person could regulate the flame precisely, providing just enough heat without making the interior so warm that the structure began to melt. The walls might glaze slightly from the warmth, creating an ice layer that actually strengthened the structure. Sleeping platforms were built up from the floor as warm air rises. Families would sleep together under thick furs, often wearing minimal clothing in the warmth of the igloo. Let me tell you about a sweet comfort food that made winter more bearable. Among the Inuit, Yupik, often called Eskimo ice cream, was a special treat. It was made by whipping together animal fat, typically seal oil or caribou fat, with berries and sometimes fish. The result was a light, fluffy mixture that was both calorie-dense and, in its own way, delicious. The berries, salmonberries, cloudberries, or crowberries that had been preserved in seal oil, provided natural sweetness and essential vitamins. A kutak was traditionally made by hand, whipped in a bowl until it reached a creamy consistency. It was served at celebrations and special gatherings, a reminder that even in the harshest environment, people found ways to create not just sustenance but joy. For savory nourishment, consider the practice of freezing fresh-caught fish. In the subarctic and Arctic regions, fish caught through holes in the ice would freeze solid within minutes. These frozen fish could be stored for months, and when needed, they would be thawed slightly and eaten raw, sliced thin like sashimi. The practice, known as quack or igyanak depending on the specific preparation and region, provided essential fats and proteins and required no fuel to prepare, a significant advantage when fuel itself was scarce. And here's an unusual delicacy that shows the remarkable resourcefulness of Arctic peoples: fermented seal flipper. The flippers would be placed in a seal skin bag with some blubber and buried in the ground or placed under stones, where the cold would slow but not stop fermentation. After several months, the flippers would develop a strong, pungent flavor and a soft texture. This fermentation process actually increased the nutritional value and provided essential vitamins, particularly during the darkest months when fresh food was nearly impossible to obtain. It's an acquired taste, certainly, but it's also a testament to the deep understanding these people had of food preservation and nutrition. As you sink deeper into comfort, your blanket warm around you, think about how shelter was never just about walls and a roof. It was about understanding materials, about learning through countless generations how to work with the environment rather than simply against it. These structures, teepees, wigwams, igluit, were not primitive. They were sophisticated responses to extreme conditions designed by people who could not afford to get it wrong. Each design reflected intimate knowledge of local climate, available materials, and the physics of heat and airflow. In some ways, these shelters were more efficient than many modern buildings, achieving comfort with minimal resources. Picture a winter evening inside one of these homes. The fire glowing, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The wind howling outside, but inside, there's warmth and safety. Children drowsing after a meal, elders telling stories, the smell of smoke and cooking. There's something deeply human about gathering close when the world outside is hostile, about creating pockets of warmth and light against the darkness and cold. Let your breathing slow even further now. Feel the weight of your body against the mattress. You're safe and warm, just as those winter communities worked so hard to ensure. And as sleep tugs gently at the edges of your consciousness, allow the story to carry you onward, into the rhythms of winter survival, into the daily practices that kept people alive through months of cold. Snow continues to fall in our story. The world outside is white and silent and so cold that your breath would freeze in your beard or on your eyelashes within moments. But inside the shelter, preparations are underway. Because surviving winter wasn't only about having a warm place to stay, it was also about what you wore when you had to venture out into that merciless cold. And venture out you did have to. Firewood needed gathering. Hunting and fishing still continued. Checking on stored food, tending to basic needs. All of these required leaving the shelter. The clothing worn for these tasks was not merely functional, it was quite literally life-saving technology. Let me tell you about the winter clothing of the Northern Plains peoples. Imagine a winter outfit made entirely from animal skins and furs, carefully selected and assembled for maximum warmth with minimum weight. It began with the innermost layer, a soft, tanned deer hide shirt and leggings, worn with the hair side against the skin. This might seem counterintuitive, wouldn't you want the fur on the outside? But the hair against the skin created tiny air pockets that trapped body heat while wicking away moisture. Moisture management was crucial. Damp clothing in extreme cold is not merely uncomfortable but deadly. Over this inner layer came an outer layer, and this one did have the hair facing out. A buffalo robe, carefully selected from a winter-killed buffalo when the coat was thickest, would be worn as a coat. The robes were sometimes painted with designs that told stories of the wearer's deeds or spiritual experiences. The hides were tanned using a labor-intensive process that involved scraping away the flesh, treating the hide with a mixture of brain matter and other materials, then working it until it became supple. A well-tanned hide was soft enough to be comfortable but tough enough to withstand the abrasion of daily use. The feet required special attention. Moccasins for winter were lined with fur, often rabbit or beaver, and stuffed with dried grass or buffalo wool for additional insulation. The soles were made from the toughest part of the buffalo hide, thick enough to protect against frozen ground but still flexible enough to allow natural movement. Some groups made mukluks, which extended up the calf or even to the knee, providing protection against deep snow. The key with footwear was ensuring it was large enough to accommodate the insulating materials and still allow good circulation. Tight footwear restricted blood flow and made frostbite more likely. Hands were protected with mittens rather than gloves, as mittens allowed the fingers to share warmth. The mittens were made from fur or hide, sometimes with an outer mitt and an inner liner that could be changed out if the liner became damp. A hunter might carry several pairs of liner mitts, swapping them as needed to ensure dry hands. Frostbitten fingers couldn't work a bow or handle tools, so hand protection was not optional. Head coverings varied. Some people wore fur hats or hoods attached to their robes. The Inuit created remarkable parkas with attached hoods that could be cinched tight around the face, leaving only the eyes exposed. These parkas were often made from caribou hide, with the winter coat of the caribou providing the perfect insulation. Some parkas were double-layered, with an inner parka worn with the hair facing in and an outer parka with the hair facing out. The hood was large enough to create an air pocket around the face, warming the air before it was breathed. Breathing through a fur ruff helped prevent the painful freezing of the lungs that could occur when breathing extremely cold air directly. Now, as you rest there, warm and drowsy, let me share something about the work that went into creating this clothing. Preparing hides was women's work in most communities, and it was skilled, respected labor that took years to master. The tanning process alone could take weeks for a single hide. First, the fresh hide had to be fleshed, scraped clean of any remaining meat and fat. Then it would be treated with tanning agents. Many groups used a mixture of the animal's brain, liver, and fat, which contained natural oils and enzymes that broke down the proteins in the hide and made it supple. The partially tanned hide would then be worked, stretched, rubbed, softened, for hours over several days. This work was often communal, with women gathering to process hides together, talking and singing as they worked. The finished hide would then be smoked over a low fire, which helped preserve it and gave it a distinctive golden brown color. Sewing the clothing required even more skill. The sinew from the back or legs of deer or buffalo was dried and then split into fine threads stronger than any plant fiber. These threads were used with bone or metal needles to sew seams that had to be absolutely tight and durable. A poorly sewn seam in a winter coat could be the difference between life and death. The stitches had to be small and close together, and in some cases, the seams would be waterproofed with fat or resin. The Inuit elevated this craft to an extraordinary level. Their parkas were not just warm, they were works of art. The women who made them were masters at judging the quality of different furs and knowing exactly which fur to use for which part of the garment. The ruff around the hood, for example, was typically made from wolverine or wolf fur because these furs have a unique property. They don't retain moisture from breath, so they don't frost up. A caribou fur ruff would become crusted with ice from breath moisture, but a wolverine ruff would stay clear. This sort of detailed, practical knowledge was accumulated over thousands of years and passed down from mother to daughter. Let me tell you about a food that provided the energy for all this work. The Lakota and Dakota peoples would make wasna, a mixture somewhat similar to pemmican but often including more plant materials. Dried, pounded meat would be mixed with animal fat, dried berries, and sometimes dried, ground prairie turnips or other roots. The result was formed into cakes or balls. A hunter or traveler could carry wasna easily, and a small amount provided substantial energy. The taste was rich and somewhat sweet from the berries, savory from the meat, and filling in a way that kept hunger at bay for hours. Around the year 1650, these nutrition-dense travel foods were already ancient, refined over so many generations that no one could remember when they were first created. For something truly sweet, imagine the treat of cached berries. Some communities would bury berries in containers, birch bark makooks, or rawhide bags. Underground where the cold soil kept them in a state of partial preservation. By midwinter, when fresh food was just a memory, opening one of these caches was an event. The berries would be partially frozen, somewhat fermented, their sugars concentrated. They could be eaten as is, mixed with fat, or stirred into soups and stews. The tartness of chokecherries or the perfumed sweetness of wild plums was a sensory reminder that winter, however long, would eventually yield again to spring. And for something unusual, the practice of eating bone marrow frozen. After butchering an animal, the long bones would be cracked open to access the marrow. In winter, this marrow would freeze solid and could be stored that way. To eat it, you'd either thaw it slightly by the fire or simply bite into it frozen. The texture was smooth, the flavor rich and fatty, and the nutritional value was tremendous. Marrow is packed with calories, vitamins, and the kind of sustaining fat that helps people maintain body heat. In the year 1704, a French trader writing about the Great Lakes region described watching with amazement as his indigenous guides ate frozen marrow with every appearance of enjoyment, something he initially found barbaric but came to appreciate as he understood the nutritional logic. As you lie there, feeling the softness of your own clothing, your comfortable blankets, spare a thought for the hours of work represented in every garment worn during those winters. The knowledge required, which animals provided the best fur, which tanning methods worked best for different hides, how to cut and sew for maximum warmth with minimum bulk. This was technology in its truest sense, applied knowledge developed and refined to solve critical problems. Picture a hunter preparing to leave the lodge on a bitter morning. He dresses in layers, each piece carefully made and carefully worn. He pulls on his fur-lined moccasins, wraps his leggings, dons his inner shirt and then his outer robe. He ties it securely, pulls on his mittens, adjusts his fur hat or pulls up his hood, steps out into the cold, and while he feels the bite of the wind, he knows his clothing will protect him. He can do the work that needs doing. He can hunt, gather wood, and check traps. He can survive. There's a particular satisfaction in being properly prepared for conditions, isn't there? In knowing you have what you need, that you've planned and prepared. As your eyes grow heavier, as your body settles more completely into rest, hold on to that feeling of security, of being protected and warm. And let the story continue to unfold, carrying you deeper into the quiet rhythms of winter survival, where each day was a careful balance of work and conservation, of community and individual responsibility. The winter dawn is pale and cold. The sun, when it finally rises, is low on the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The world feels hushed, as if sound itself has frozen. But inside the lodge, there is quiet activity. Today is a hunting day, and hunting in winter is not the same as hunting in the abundant seasons. Everything about it is harder, more dangerous, and yet also more essential. The stores of dried meat will last only so long. Fresh meat is needed, both for nutrition and for morale. Let me take you into the frozen world of the winter hunt. For the peoples of the plains, winter hunting focused primarily on buffalo, deer, and smaller game. The buffalo, those great shaggy beasts, would gather in sheltered valleys where the wind was less fierce and where they could paw through the snow to reach the dried grass beneath. Finding them required skill and knowledge. Hunters looked for signs, tracks, droppings, the telltale worn paths where buffalo had moved through. They read the landscape, knowing which areas offered the best shelter and thus the best chance of finding game. The approach required patience. A hunter might spend hours belly crawling through the snow, moving so slowly that he seemed part of the landscape. The buffalo's eyesight was not particularly keen, but their sense of smell was extraordinary, so the hunter had to approach from downwind. In winter, with snow cover, sound carried differently, and the crunch of footsteps could alert prey from a surprising distance. The most skilled hunters moved in near silence, and they did so while wearing bulky fur clothing and carrying weapons. The weapons themselves were adapted to winter conditions. Bows had to be kept warm because extreme cold made sinew bowstrings brittle and less elastic. A hunter might keep his bow under his robe until the moment he needed it. Arrows were checked carefully for straightness and integrity. A warped arrow would not fly true, and you might only get one shot. For close-range hunting or finishing wounded game, spears and clubs were used. Later, after contact with Europeans, some groups acquired firearms, but guns had their own challenges in winter. Black powder could be affected by moisture, metal could freeze to bare skin, and the noise of a shot could trigger an avalanche in hilly terrain. When a buffalo was killed, the work truly began. The animal had to be butchered quickly before the meat froze solid, which it would do in minutes in the coldest weather. This was communal work when possible. The hide was carefully removed, as it would be needed. The meat was cut into manageable sections. Nothing was wasted. The liver might be eaten right there, still warm, by the hunters, a tradition that provided immediate nourishment and celebrated the animal's sacrifice. The tongue, considered a delicacy, would be saved. The hump meat, layered with fat, was prized. Even the stomach might be used as a container to carry other parts. The meat and hide would be loaded onto travois if dogs or horses were available, or carried on the hunters' backs if not. The return to camp was a moment of celebration. A successful hunt meant full bellies, warm hides, renewed supplies. The women would take charge of the butchering and preservation, working efficiently even in the cold. Some meat would be cooked immediately in great communal meals. Some would be hung to freeze, natural refrigeration that kept it fresh. Some would be processed into jerky or pemmican to replenish the stores. In the northern forests, deer hunting followed different patterns. Deer in winter were weakened by the cold and the scarcity of food. Deep snow made their movement difficult, and hunters could sometimes follow them on snowshoes, eventually running them to exhaustion. This method, called hounding or chase hunting, required tremendous endurance from the hunters but was often successful. Deer were smaller than buffalo, so a successful hunt might mean each hunter could carry the entire animal back to camp. Snowshoes were essential technology for winter hunting in deep snow regions. They distributed the hunter's weight over a larger area, allowing him to walk on top of snow that would otherwise swallow him to the thigh or deeper. Traditional snowshoes were made from a wooden frame bent into shape and laced with rawhide webbing. Different designs existed for different snow conditions. Some were long and narrow for fast travel on packed snow. Others were wide and rounded for soft, deep powder. Making snowshoes was skilled work, and a good pair, well maintained, could last for years. The Inuit hunted seals through the sea ice, and this required yet another set of skills and tremendous patience. Seals need to breathe, and in the winter, they maintain breathing holes in the ice. A hunter would find a breathing hole, sometimes by using a dog to sniff them out, and then wait. Not for minutes, but for hours. Standing or sitting in the brutal cold, perfectly still, waiting for the seal to surface. When it did, the hunter had only seconds to strike with a harpoon. The harpoon head was designed to detach from the shaft and toggle under the seal's skin, connected by a strong line. The seal would dive, but the hunter would hold the line, beginning a test of strength and endurance. Gradually, the seal would tire, and the hunter would pull it up onto the ice. Every part of the seal was used. The meat provided food. The blubber was rendered for lamp oil and eating. The hide made clothing and boat covers. The intestines could be made into waterproof garments or containers. The bones became tools and toys. The sinew became thread. A seal hunt was not just about food, it was about obtaining materials essential for continued survival. Let me tell you about a warming food enjoyed after a cold day's hunt. Among the Cree and Anishinaabe, a rich stew called rubabu was a staple. It was made by simmering chunks of fresh or dried meat with whatever else was available: wild rice, beans if they had them, perhaps some dried corn, roots like wild onions or Jerusalem artichokes, and fat. Lots of fat. The result was a thick, hearty stew that warmed you from the inside out. Sitting around the fire after hours in the cold, eating rhubarb from a wooden bowl, feeling the warmth spread through your body, there was comfort in that, a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere nutrition. For something sweet, consider the practice of collecting and eating the inner bark of certain trees. In late winter and early spring, when other food sources were at their lowest, the Anishinaabe and others would carefully harvest the inner bark of pine, spruce, or birch. This bark, called cambium, was the living, growing layer of the tree. It could be eaten raw. It was slightly sweet and surprisingly tender, or dried and ground into a flour. It provided essential vitamins and calories when little else was available. A good-sized pine tree could yield several pounds of edible bark without killing the tree, a sustainable harvest that demonstrated remarkable knowledge of botany and ecology. Historical accounts from the 1750s describe French trappers learning this practice from indigenous guides and crediting it with saving their lives during a particularly harsh winter. And here's an unusual food tradition: frozen whitefish livers. In the Great Lakes region and the subarctic, whitefish were a staple. The livers, rich and fatty, would be removed during cleaning and frozen. Later, they might be eaten frozen, sliced thin, or thawed slightly and warmed by the fire. The texture was creamy, the flavor intense and oily. It was packed with vitamins A and D, critically important during the dark months when sunlight was scarce. Vitamin D deficiency could lead to weakened bones and teeth, depression, and reduced immune function. Without knowing the biochemistry, people knew that certain foods kept them healthy, and those foods were valued and shared. As you drift deeper into relaxation, your muscles loose and heavy, imagine the return from a successful hunt. The hunters approach the camp, and someone spots them, calling out the good news. The community gathering, helping to unload the meat, everyone working together. Children playing with scraps of hide, dogs barking excitedly, the smell of cooking meat beginning to fill the air. There's laughter and talk, stories of the hunt being told and retold. The immediate crisis is averted. There will be food for another stretch of days. The tension eases. Hunting in winter was dangerous. Frostbite, injury, getting lost in a sudden storm, all were real risks. Yet the hunters went out because they had to, and they did so with skill honed over lifetimes, with tools and techniques refined over centuries. They read the land and the weather with an intimacy that's hard for us to imagine. They understood animal behavior, tracking, and the physics of their weapons. They worked within the harsh constraints of winter and still provided for their people. Let your mind rest now on the image of a lodge in the evening, the day's hunting done, the meat being prepared, the fire warm. The sense of accomplishment, of having met the challenge of the day. The knowledge that tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight there is enough. Tonight there is warmth and food and the presence of family and community. Allow that peaceful satisfaction to settle over you, to quiet your thoughts, to ease you further into the gentle embrace of sleep as we move onward through the winter's story. Snow is still falling outside, but now it's been falling for days, perhaps weeks. The world is muffled, the drifts deep, the paths between lodges worn into tunnels through the snow. The sun, when it appears at all, is a pale disk that provides light but little warmth. These are the deep winter months, the long dark, when the world contracts to the space inside the lodge and the community within reach. This is the time when survival becomes less about dramatic hunts and more about the steady, patient maintenance of daily life, the careful management of resources, and the strength drawn from community and culture. Inside the winter lodge, life follows rhythms dictated by necessity and tradition. The day begins slowly. The fire that was banked overnight is stirred back to life, fed carefully with wood that must last. Water, if it's not frozen, is set to heat. If there's no liquid water nearby, snow is collected and melted, a slow process, as snow is mostly air and yields surprisingly little water for the volume. Bodies that were nested together under furs for shared warmth begin to stir. There's no rushing in winter. Every action is deliberate, conserving energy. Meals in deep winter are often simple. Breakfast might be leftover stew, reheated, or a corn mush, or a piece of pemmican eaten with some dried berries and hot water. The goal is to provide enough fuel for the body to maintain its temperature and perform the day's tasks. Children would be fed first, then the elders, then the adults. This hierarchy of care ensured that the most vulnerable were protected and that those who could produce more food when it was available were sustained. The work of winter was constant but different from the work of other seasons. Wood had to be gathered. In forested areas, this was a daily task. Dead standing wood was preferred. It was drier than fallen wood and burned better. The wood had to be hauled back to the lodge, cut to size, and stacked where it would stay dry. This was often men's work, though in many cultures, women and older children helped as well. It was cold work, and there was always the danger of injury from axe or saw, from falling wood, or from exposure if someone went out alone and had an accident. Women worked on maintaining and creating clothing, repairing items that were damaged, and preparing materials for the coming seasons. A woman might spend hours working a piece of sinew into fine thread, or scraping a hide, or sewing quills or beads into decorative patterns on a pair of moccasins. This work was practical, but it was also artistic. The patterns and designs held meanings, clan symbols, representations of visions, geometric forms that were simply beautiful. Creating beautiful things, even in the hardest times, is a deeply human impulse, a way of asserting that life is more than mere survival. Children, when not helping with chores, played. They played games that were often practiced for adult skills. Boys might have miniature bows and arrows and practice shooting at targets. Girls might have small cradle boards and dolls, practicing the care they would give to their own children someday. They played games in the snow, building forts and sleds, racing and wrestling. Laughter is a sound that defies the cold, a reminder that even when conditions are harsh, joy finds a way. Elders were the keepers of knowledge and story. In the long evenings, when darkness came early and there were hours to fill before sleep, the elders would tell stories. These were not idle entertainments, though they certainly entertained. They were the oral history of the people, the repository of law and custom, the teaching tales that instructed the young in proper behavior and spiritual understanding. A story might explain why the seasons change, or teach the importance of sharing, or preserve the memory of a great event from generations past. The stories knit the community together, linked them to their ancestors, and provided a framework for understanding the world. There were also songs and music. Drums, rattles, flutes. These instruments were played in ceremonies and also in more informal settings. Singing together created a sense of unity. The rhythms and melodies carried meanings and emotions that transcended words. In some cultures, individuals had personal songs, received in dreams or visions, that were their spiritual property. Music was not separate from daily life. It was woven through it. The spiritual life of the community was especially important during winter. Ceremonies and rituals marked the passage of time and reinforced social bonds and cosmic connections. The Haudenosaunee celebrated the midwinter ceremony, a multi-day event that included feasting, dancing, games, and the recitation of the Thanksgiving address, a long-spoken acknowledgement of gratitude to all parts of the natural world. This ceremony occurred at the time of the new year, and it was a time of renewal, of putting aside old grievances and starting fresh. The games played during the midwinter ceremony were vigorous: lacrosse on snow, snow snake where a carved pole was hurled down an icy track, and others. These games were not merely recreation. They had spiritual significance, and participating in them was a way of contributing to the well-being of the community. Let me tell you about a food that brought people together. Among many groups, a special occasion might call for making fresh bread or cakes. Cornbread, for example, is made from ground cornmeal mixed with water and sometimes sweetened with maple sugar or berries, then baked in the ashes or on hot stones. The process of making bread, grinding the corn, mixing the dough, tending the baking, was communal. And the smell of baking bread in the close confines of a winter lodge was a small miracle, a sensory gift that lifted everyone's spirits. The bread was dense and filling, slightly sweet, with a texture that was hearty and satisfying. Eating warm bread with perhaps a bit of bear grease or berry jam was a treat that made the cold and the confinement easier to bear. For something savory, consider the dried fish that were a staple in many regions. Salmon, whitefish, pike, or other fish that had been dried in the autumn would be rehydrated and cooked into soups or stews, or simply eaten after being softened. The drying process concentrated the flavor, so the fish had an intense, almost smoky taste. The bones softened during the drying and could be eaten, providing calcium. A fish stew with wild onions and herbs, thickened with a bit of ground seed or cornmeal, was both nourishing and comforting, the kind of meal that warmed you through a long evening. And for something unusual, here's a practice that might make you smile or grimace: the making of fish head soup. In the Great Lakes and northern regions, no part of the fish was wasted. The heads, which were rich with gelatinous meat, particularly in the cheeks and around the bones, would be simmered for hours to make a rich broth. The eyes, again rich in fats and vitamins, would be considered special morsels. The soup would be seasoned with whatever herbs were available and perhaps some wild leeks if they'd been dried. The result was a thick, nutritious soup that had a deep, complex flavor. It's a dish that reflects the principle of using everything, of finding value in parts that others might discard. In the year 1680, a Jesuit missionary recorded his initial revulsion at being offered fish head soup and his later appreciation after realizing how nourishing it was. As you lie there in your comfortable bed, warm and safe, think about what it must have been like to spend months in close quarters with your community. The lack of privacy, the constant proximity to others. It would be challenging, certainly. Tensions would arise. People would irritate each other. Yet the cultures that endured developed strong social mechanisms for managing conflict. Respect for elders, clear roles and responsibilities, protocols for resolving disputes, and above all, the understanding that survival depended on cooperation. Individualism had to be balanced with the needs of the group. There were rituals for sharing. Many cultures had traditions requiring that a successful hunter distribute the meat widely, not keeping it all for his own family. This ensured that even those who were less able to hunt, the elderly, the sick, families with many small children, still received food. It was a form of social insurance, and it was deeply ingrained. Generosity was not just admired, it was expected and enforced by social pressure and, in many cases, by spiritual belief. The animals gave themselves to the people, the stories said, and it was an insult to the spirits to be greedy or wasteful. Picture an evening in the lodge. The fire burns low, its light flickering on the walls. A grandmother is telling a story, her voice rising and falling with the drama of the tale. Children are lying on furs, their eyes wide, listening. Adults are working on small tasks, sharpening a knife, mending a snare, sorting beads. Someone laughs at a part of the story. A baby fusses and is soothed. Outside, the wind howls, but inside, there's warmth and togetherness. This is the heart of winter survival, the community, the knowledge that you are not alone, that others share your struggle and will help carry the burden. The stories and songs that remind you who you are and where you come from. The small daily acts of kindness and cooperation that build a web of interdependence strong enough to hold against the cold. Let that sense of community, of shared warmth and purpose, settle into your own heart now. Feel the connection to others, even as you rest alone. You are part of a larger human story, one that stretches back through countless generations of people who faced hardship and found ways not only to survive but to live with dignity, creativity, and even joy. As your breathing slows and deepens, as sleep draws nearer, carry that knowledge with you into the gentle darkness, and let us move into the final chapter, where winter begins, at last, to loosen its grip. The darkness is not absolute anymore. The days, imperceptibly at first, are growing longer. The sun, though still weak, climbs a fraction higher in the sky each day. The wind, though still cold, occasionally carries a scent that is not quite pure ice. These are the subtle signs that winter is breaking, that the world is beginning its slow turn back toward warmth and light. But these are dangerous days too. Late winter storms can be the fiercest. The supplies that seemed ample in the autumn are now depleted. This is the hungry time, the time when survival is most precarious, when the hope of spring is tempered by the reality that spring is still weeks away. Let me tell you what these weeks were like. The stores of dried meat and fish are running low. The pemmican that seemed inexhaustible in December is carefully rationed now. Meals become smaller, simpler. People lose weight, their bodies consuming stored fat to stay warm. Weakness sets in. The very young and very old are at greatest risk. This was the time when communities relied most heavily on their deep knowledge of the land and its hidden resources. In the northern forests, this was the time to harvest the inner bark of trees I mentioned earlier, and to tap maples for sap if the temperatures were right, freezing at night, thawing during the day. The maple sap would begin to run, and collecting it was a sign of hope. The sap itself could be drunk fresh, a slightly sweet water that provided hydration and a small amount of sugar. Or it could be boiled down into syrup or sugar. The boiling was a long process, requiring constant attention and a lot of firewood, but the result was worth it. A concentrated source of energy and a taste of sweetness that was a profound psychological boost as much as a nutritional one. Ice fishing became increasingly important. As the days lengthened, fish became more active under the ice. Holes would be cut or maintained in the ice, and lines would be dropped, often with simple hooks baited with scraps of meat or even just a bit of colored thread or feather to attract the fish. Patience was required, hours of sitting by a hole in the ice, but the reward of fresh fish was significant. Fresh food, after months of dried and preserved stores, was a gift. In the plains, the buffalo began to move more, and hunting picked up. The animals were gaunt from the winter, but they were there, and they were life. A late winter hunt could replenish supplies just enough to see a community through to the spring. But there were years when the hunting failed, when the stores ran out, when the fish didn't bite. These were the starvation times, remembered in oral histories with sorrow and respect. In these times, people ate anything, boiled hides, bones crushed and boiled to extract the last bit of marrow and grease, the emergency caches that were meant to be untouched except in the direst need. They relied on the generosity of neighboring communities if possible, and they prayed to the spirits for help. The resilience required to survive these times is difficult to comprehend. The psychological strength to keep going when you're hungry, cold, and exhausted, when the people you love are suffering and there's nothing you can do but endure and hope. Yet they did endure. They told stories to keep their spirits up. They sang songs. They took care of each other. And they waited for the signs that winter was truly ending. Those signs came gradually. A raven calling in a slightly different way. The snow begins to melt during the day, even if it refrozes at night. Water dripping from icicles. The first brave birds returning from the south. Each sign was noted, discussed, and celebrated quietly. The world was coming back to life. And then one day, you'd see it, a patch of bare ground. Just a small spot where the snow had melted away completely, revealing the earth beneath, dark and wet. Or you'd hear running water, a stream that had been locked under ice now gurgling free. Or you'd see the first shoots of green pushing up through the soil, impossibly delicate and impossibly determined. Spring was not an instant transformation. It took weeks for the snow to fully melt, for the ice on the lakes to break up, for the warmth to really establish itself. But the psychological shift happened sooner. Once you knew winter was breaking, once you could feel in your bones that survival was no longer in doubt, a weight lifted. People emerged from their lodges more. They visited each other. They began to plan for the seasons ahead. The spring hunts, the planting, the gathering, the repairs and construction that needed doing. Let me tell you about a food that marked the transition. When the ice broke up on the rivers, the spring fish runs would begin. Salmon in the Pacific Northwest, sturgeon in the Great Lakes, shad along the Atlantic rivers. These fish returned in enormous numbers to spawn. The first catch of spring fish was a moment of celebration. The fish were fresh, and after months of dried food, fresh fish tasted like life itself. They would be prepared in every way imaginable, roasted on sticks over a fire, boiled in soups, the roe eaten fresh or dried for later. A feast of fresh fish, perhaps with the first wild greens gathered from the forest floor, was a celebration of having survived, of the world's renewal. For something sweet, imagine the first ripe berries of late spring or early summer. Strawberries, tiny wild ones that grew low to the ground, appeared first. They were small, but their flavor was concentrated and intensely sweet. Eating sun-warmed wild strawberries after a winter of dried food was almost overwhelming. The juiciness, the sweetness, the sheer abundance of flavor. Many cultures had ceremonies to celebrate the first strawberries, giving thanks for the return of growing things. And for something unusual, consider the practice of eating the first tender shoots of certain plants. Fiddleheads, the coiled young fronds of ferns, were harvested in the early spring. They had a unique flavor, slightly nutty and green, and they were rich in vitamins after the nutritional austerity of winter. They could be boiled or steamed, and they signaled that the wild gardens were opening again, that food would be available from the land, not just from stores and hunting. As you rest there, your body completely relaxed, your mind drifting, picture that moment of realization that winter is over. The warmth on your face from the sun that's finally strong enough to be felt. The sound of water, everywhere, water flowing, dripping, the land coming alive with the sound. The smell of earth, rich and dark and alive. The impossible green of new growth. The people who survived these winters did more than simply not die. They maintained their cultures, their languages, their spiritual lives. They created art and music. They laughed and loved and raised children. They adapted to new challenges as climates shifted over the centuries and as contact with other peoples brought new technologies and new disruptions. The knowledge they accumulated about survival in extreme conditions is part of humanity's heritage, a testament to ingenuity, cooperation, and the sheer stubborn will to continue. Their descendants live today, carrying forward traditions and knowledge, adapting as they have always adapted, surviving as they have always survived. The story of winter survival is not a story from a distant, irrelevant past. It's a story about what humans can do, about the strength that emerges from necessity, about the ways that communities hold each other up when times are hard. As winter broke and the world warmed, life changed. The focus shifted from mere survival to growth, to abundance, to the active work of spring and summer. But the lessons of winter remained. The importance of preparation, the value of community, the need to balance individual needs with the needs of the group, the deep knowledge of the environment and how to work with it, the spiritual understanding that humans are not separate from nature but part of it, dependent on it, responsible to it. Let these lessons drift through your mind now as you sink deeper into sleep. The patience to endure difficult times. The importance of preparation and planning. The strength that comes from community and mutual support. The resilience to keep going even when the situation seems hopeless. The joy found in small things, a warm fire, a full belly, a child's laughter, a story shared. You are warm and safe. Your breathing is slow and deep. Your body is heavy, relaxed, at peace. You have traveled through a winter with people who lived centuries ago, and yet in some ways, their experiences are not so different from the challenges we all face. We all have winters in our lives, difficult times that test us. And like those people, we can prepare, we can endure, we can support each other, and we can emerge into spring. Thank you for traveling through this gentle piece of history with me tonight. We've walked together through the preparation, the shelters, the clothing, the hunts, the long dark days, and finally the breaking of winter. We've seen how people survived not through magic but through knowledge, community, and remarkable determination. If this story helped ease you into peaceful sleep, I'd love to hear where you drifted off. Was it during the gathering season? Or perhaps while learning about winter lodges? Let me know in the comments below if you'd like. And if you find comfort in this journey, the like and subscribe buttons are there. No pressure, only if it feels right. Sleep well, dear friend. May your dreams be warm and peaceful. May you rest deeply and wake refreshed. The story is finished now. Winter has passed. Spring has come. And you can let go completely, drifting into the softest, deepest sleep. Good night.